All right, welcome. This is a course or a talk on something that I get asked about a lot, which I always find to be really difficult to understand and kind of wrap my head around as far as a student question. And in order to explain it to others, kind of started to create this big framework to explain it to myself. And so the question that I got that this is the result of is, how do I learn anatomy without having to learn it? Which I get. I get for any number of reasons that anatomy is hard, it's frustrating. It's always like this bizarre road, like this bizarre offshoot on the path that you actually want to be traveling if you want to be doing dynamic characters or fun, inventive figures or creatures. The anatomy feels like this weird pit stop where you have to kind of change gears and do something completely foreign and different in order to get to the destination. So this would be a way to hopefully alleviate some of that, or at least give you a map for that detour on the way to where you'd like to be. But it is an attempt to address the question as far as the real student concern. How do you learn anatomy without having to learn it? And so the way that my mind started to process that is, well, we can adjust our process. We can adjust the way that we kind of look and aim our interests. This is something that can invite more subjectivity instead of anatomy is what it is. Like it's the muscle is the muscle, and there's not always that much room for invention, creativity, fun. So that tries this approach tries to invite that a little bit more. So here's where I'm going to start in terms of the layout of what I have here. Let me just orient you to some of the things that I've put on the page. So there's a couple bars here. This is my proportion chart. So this is covered in a lot of the past content that I've made, figure construction course, and it's just a head and a foot. I'm going to divide this into halves and then thirds and reassess the way I want to use a mannequin for the figure. So just to give you some context, in the prior figure construction course lessons I've done, textbook, the figure drawing design invention, there's a process that goes from gesture to construction that is very step by step, very kind of rooted in do this, do this, do that. This is slightly different. So I would say that approach falls more on the constructive anatomy, Glenn Villepeu side of things. The approach I'm going through more now would be kind of leaning towards Riley side more, right? So it's not totally that, because I don't fully understand that in a way that makes me kind of fluent in it, but it's my version of it. From there, so once we have that, that gives us more access to shape more quickly, as opposed to the other method that's more perspective driven, line driven. This is, or the photographs that I've put to the side here would be the Howard Schatz 1988 Olympic team photographs, which I love. I think they're a great template to look at and understand form, function, and body type, right? So we can take a whole study out of these of shape, where shape and body type changes, what that communicates in terms of an activity that the body possesses or performs on the regular. And so I'll start this kind of whole process by molding the mannequin that is derivative or based in shapes into looking or feeling more directly like these, without, again, having to go through the buildup of every single muscle that you see in a anatomical breakdown in a book or something like that. And then the last part would be like where your interest lies. So my interest is history, right? So my three fields that I've loved my whole life would be how to make a drawing, which is maybe the illustration side of things, fine art, which would be the reasoning or the conceptual aim behind what you do, and then history, which would be what have others done in the past and how have they used it. One of my favorite classes I taught was the history of American illustration. And one of the things that is so predominant in that field is the change of body type to create a different feeling or emotion in an audience in order to garner sales, or maybe to manufacture desire for another look that is not currently in vogue, so that your consumer has to buy a wealth of products to adopt another look. And then maybe how those looks or archetypes are impacted by social or political tensions of a period. And so I try to create, or what I'm interested in creating as far as how I would follow something like this through is what is a timeline for how we've looked at bodies and how have bodies changed on the regular. It seems that they change, or a commercial idea of what is beautiful in a body changes about every 10 years or so. So in the American or history of American illustration, you see illustrators do this very directly and regularly, and they're identified with it, like the Gibson girl. John Held Jr. created the flapper type, or any number of illustrators from the history of American illustration. So that's how I like to look at these. So each one of these is a different shape, right? And each shape has a certain form, language, or logic to it that communicates the body type, and then it's almost always in contrast to the one prior. So those are the three big pieces that I'm working with, right? Is how are we looking at the body, the mannequin, as a specific tool, a new tool, so that we can bypass some of the rigors of anatomy to begin looking for a direct way of communicating subject in reference to study, which could be, in this case, the Olympic athletes that I've chosen. And then I would aim it personally at trying to learn and study these ebbs and flows of body type and interest in the history of American illustration, because that would be, as a historian, something that I'm really intrigued by. For you, maybe it's, the form language of a character designer you like, or the form language of a company you would like to work for, and you're trying to understand and break down that specific design language. Okay, so that's what I'm doing. That's what I've got here. So the first part of that, or how we would start that, would be, well, let's look at a new way to think about the figure that is not gesture, shape, tilt, connection, landmark. If you're familiar with the way that I've been working previously, rooted in that as a process. What we can still keep is just a general thinking of proportion. So proportion would be, in terms of the way that I would use it in my class study, the same. Right? So I don't think that we have to go through and really worry too much about creating a different type of proportion chart. In fact, if you've already done the prior work of learning proportions, building up your figures in a way that you're comfortable. Let's see here. I'll pause just because this isn't working. Let's get some. Where's the drawing? Oh, that must be this. If you have gone through the process of building the figure in the prior method, this is really going to benefit you, right? I think that would be my preferred, or my suggested order of learning, is maybe do something that's constructive and then go into doing something that's more designed in terms of how you think of the figure. But the proportion chart is the same regardless. So let's just do a quick review of that in case you're coming to this new. So in my proportions, I've done two lines. There's a top and a bottom. This is top here, the head, bottom will be the foot. The way that I start to break this up, and there's even some short videos online of me doing this. And then I say in those videos that I don't like math, and that's why I do it this way. And then everyone reminds me that it's still math, and I appreciate it. But this is the limits of my math ability, that I can do halves and thirds, and that's it. So anything multiplication, let's say if I were needing to divide, then I would really be in trouble. So this is my initial half. That would be halfway between the head and the foot. Here's another half. That's going to be divided 2 more times here and here. So that gives me 4 heads. That would be head down to bottom of the pelvis, and then do the exact same thing down here. That gives me 8 heads. So I have a little bit of a chart here that just helps me to orient shape, really, to get started. I find this kind of method or way of thinking about drawing useful when I'm not in a super technical mindset. Like sometimes this might be the same for you. You can notice that your mindset is in a specific place. Like you feel more patient, more especially patient. And so maybe I really want to dig into like construction and cross hatching, things that would require a lot of focus and attention. But I don't always feel like that, right? So it doesn't mean that I shouldn't be creative or draw or work. It just means that maybe I have to develop and be sympathetic to a different way of drawing. So this is kind of where I'm feeling. So this would be more about the development of the figure by way of shape. But it doesn't mean that all the things you might know are out the window. I think this could be an advancement of what we've done prior. So in terms of how would we understand the figure in this new way, or this mannequin shape driven way that can borrow on what we know, but doesn't have to go through all of the long and drawn out steps? Well, here's a different way of thinking of workflow. So in terms of my workflow here, what I like to think about first is what is the part or shape? So you could name these things whatever you want. Let's just say part or shape, and then let's change this up here instead of just, so that could be misleading. Let's say this is an alternative way to draw the figure that is be more based in the 2D. So we'll just label this now as our process. I like to start with the part or the shape. And so in the body, I'm going to reduce my parts down. When we did gesture, if you watch any of those previous gesture videos, there were 8 parts: head, spine, rib cage, pelvis, etc. This I'm going to reduce into a few. Say there's head shape, neck shape. Let's say there's a torso shape, which will summarize rib cage, waist, and pelvis. So that's fantastic. And then legs and arms. Right? And each one of these can be designed differently. In other words, I don't always have to make the exact same head shape. And so here's a way to think about that early on. Let's just do a little compare and contrast. In the prior way of drawing, let's just take the head as an example to begin. The head is a ball. That's the cranial mass. We found proportional ways of dividing the eye line to understand the tilt and the perspective. We did a T or a cross to find the symmetry line. And then from there, we would later assemble and add on the mandible, jaw, etc. And then we would then arrive at the shape. That's a lot of time, right? It's a lot of work just to get a dumb head shape. So instead, what we can do is just manufacture the shape. We could just say instead, the head is the whole of that shape early on. Maybe it's this. And so the argument for one or the other could be, well, you have to do this initially to understand and really design well the shape as a total. Because the shape itself is composed of all of these things that in unison create the whole silhouette, right? So that's kind of just to give you more of a grounding. But then from this, you could also say, well, now let's try to advance it. After I understand the part or the shape, then I'm going to communicate some kind of gesture to that part or shape, right? So this would now take on some different qualities. So what could gesture be? So when I think of gesture, let's do some concerns. Gesture could be the tilt of a head. So this could be positioning, right? So let's say tilt, let's say B could be maybe the turn, which would also be rotation. These are placement issues. So once I understand the part and what I want it to be or look like, then I'll start to shift into positioning. So what would this head look like tilted? Well, okay, I would just take that and give it a different 2-dimensional axis. So maybe my head is this, and now it's that. So that would lean the head. So you're acting in that sense with the shape of the head. What would be the turn or the rotation? The turn or the rotation would be borrowing on this. So let's go, here's how the two approaches will inform each other. This is the center line. In this last approach, we were really careful about where that T faced in terms of the head, the symmetry line of the head to the brow, to give us a 3/4 or a profile or something off profile, whatever you want. But now if I want to do this, maybe we'll keep the head tilted, but turn it 3/4. Well, now I'm gonna start to shift the chin, which would, again, in that last approach, we would anchor it to that vertical so that it moves with it. And now I'll move it over here. Right, so now we'd have that 3/4 head, or the head looking that direction. This one was just straight out, looking right, tilted, but still symmetrical, facing forward. This one now would be 3/4 tilted and turning away. So while I find this to be more fun because you're playing more quickly with shapes, it's sometimes easy to overlook these positioning qualities or these gesture qualities that the last approach forces you to do. So that's where you can kind of juggle the two, right? You could say, just notice what's going on with your drawings. And if you feel like you need that to help slow you down, notice a few things, that you can always combine them, mix them together. But then what I don't think you get in the last approach that I like in this is, let's say the third condition here, let's C under gesture. So A being tilt, B being turn or rotation. Let's say C is modification. And this is where I start to have more fun more quickly. So to modify a shape is a different gestural concern. That gives me character in a way that the last approach I don't think could really get near until like a very later stage in the drawing, which would be to say that since we're working with shape, now I can possess and start to incorporate all the qualities of shape. So, and let's just look at the basics here. Like if I'm just focusing on my geometries, I have a sphere or a circle, I have a square, and I have a triangle. And depending on how I use and incorporate these different shapes, I can start to tweak and inform a different quality of psychology. And this is where you could really quickly, really early on, start to implement a thinking of character design. So just, caveat, I am not a character designer at all. I don't like it. It's not, I love the product, the finished result. I like thinking about it, but I don't have any experience doing it. It's not something that interests me, but I mention it here because I think most people that want to learn to draw figures or are creative with figures and want to do something like that. And it's really interesting to me from the point of view of storytelling. But I don't know, I don't have an imagination of my own where I would be able to design a character. But I always see this when looking, right? That we have, in terms of the shapes and their psychologies, really like set definitive archetypes. Round things are almost always perceived as cute. So my mind, in contrast, right, my interest where I would take that is, okay, well, I'm going to go read every book on cute. And then I'm going to read every book on kitsch. And then I'm going to read everything on low culture. And, so that's the rabbit hole I would go down. And by the way, a great book on cute is May, right? On Cute. Her last name is May. It's fantastic. Small book if you want to think about what cute aesthetics are, their history, how we continue to participate with them in the present. Really fascinating. So, right, that's one. Square would be, if we look at the history of body types and heroic characters, we always get a character that is some version of a square. So we could start to create some qualities here. Like, so maybe the sphere is passive, cute. Sometimes we would see a sphere, an ellipse in art history, and that could be an identification of a saint, some kind of religious attributes. But you can see how this step almost immediately puts me into some kind of design framing where shapes aren't just their basic geometries, they're also doorways into ways that people have communicated with them. And I think character design is just the tip of the iceberg, right? It's a way that people are using them now that are very direct, obvious, and they generate a feeling or an identification with the character, so you get that quality really quickly. But they also have compositional implications in art history. And so the square would be, let's say, stable. We could just make these associations. Maybe stubborn. Like I'm thinking of maybe think of comic book superhero who is all squared body types, and then contrast that with a shorter, stubbier or stockier square that could be the old man and up, right? That the square can still have a range of use and implication. It doesn't have to be like one monolithic effect forever and ever. And then the same thing with the triangle, right? The triangle could be stable if we put it base down, or maybe it could be more aggressive if we thin it, stretch it, and make it more predatory in nature, sharpen it. So this is a way that you can impact every single part as you design it to find likeness, right? In a way that would be maybe a little bit gentle, right? That you're just starting to shape your parts to find likeness. Or it could be very extreme and you're impacting your shapes to create kind of very exaggerated versions of a part. So how would that look if we just kind of take the basic idea of the head? Well, so let's say this is a generic head, and in this head, it's probably more on the masculine side, but why is it on the masculine side? Oh, it's because I've made this bottom part squarer, right? So what is the reason that that might feel more masculine? Well, men tend to have a wider transition from mandible to ramus in their jaw. Women tend to have less so. And so maybe a female shape would be, I would start to lean more toward the curve in the shape. So that would be a gentle way to start to use and modify shape by way of thinking about, likeness through geometry. Or we can make it more extreme. The more extreme version I think of, because I haven't played a video game in a while, but one of the ones I really liked was Dishonored. I think it was an Arcane Studios game. And they had every class of character in that game was really specific in their archetype and head shape. So there was like a soldier class that was very squared. There was a aristocratic class that was kind of tall and elegant in terms of the head shape and size. There was a sick or diseased group of class or people in the game that were just deformed and sphere-like. And then you in that game, the archetypal character was like a skull shape, which is iconic for that. And that's a way of communicating extreme shape as a key to understanding story. So that would be the third one, right? That I don't think is a step available to you in the gesture prior build-up, which is just nuts and bolts. How do you construct a figure? How do you put anatomy on top? So that's a long way about that, but there you go. And then the third thing, so the last step would be perspective. And I think of perspective in a really edited, non-existent way where I'm only giving things wrapping lines. So, perspective of this head, I'm just going to be giving wraps because I intend in this approach to be using value to show perspective. So I would be mapping my value on top. So perspective here would be like if we use those, let's do a head shape. I'm only going to use my rubber bands. So wrapping lines or cross contours would just be envisioning the way that shape is leaning as a perspective. And then I'm using these kind of sympathetic cross contours to that form to set me up for kind of thinking about the turn of that. That's it. So it would just be here wraps, and then you would later revisit it with, however you want to develop value. So you're just trying to set up that quick mannequin to be able to sell the idea of value. Okay. So that would be process. Probably, the most technical will be is just that. But those give you some steps. You can play around with them. You can reposition them. But let's now spend some time trying to define what parts we can start out with. Well, what are the parts that we might want to modify? So in the head, I gave you your head shape. Here's the modification of the head shape: tilt, turn, modification, perspective. So that's all the steps right there. The only one that I'll add, which let's say is not even a step itself, but let's just make it a star. And that would be when you're going through this process, the only thing I find to be challenging for people is that because this is a part-to-part approach. So let's go back up here and process. Let's just write this is part-to-part. I do one part, I finish it, I move to the next. That's a stark contrast to the gesture approach, where it's the whole thing down at once so that you see everything developing from the ground up, all things and how they relate. I find that the difficulty people have with this is that when you're only looking at one thing at a time, it's very difficult to project the proportion, the whole, how things will relate. So I add a little, like a reminder that once I finish 2 or more parts, I interrupt my 1, 2, 3 and just do connections. Like, how are things connecting? How do things look together? So I'll double check in here my T's, how things are overlapping or wrapping. And then I also make myself double check proportions, which I'm not great at, to be honest. So I make myself check them in 3 ways. So maybe like sighting. That's one way of checking proportions. I could measure. 2 could be, maybe I check with positive and negative shapes. I'll double check the shape between the arm and the torso. And if I get that shape right, then I've placed like 4 things correctly. And then maybe I'll double check with a few plumb lines. You don't have to draw all these things down. You could just do like mental checks in your head. Plumb lines being, how do verticals and horizontals that are strict in their orientation line things up. So that would be my last step there. Okay, so if we did a front view, what would those parts be? Let's do some parts. So we already did the first, so let's make a head. So here's my head shape. And I'm just going to go for a basic egg for now. But there's my part. And hopefully you can already start to see ways that you might want to modify that. Right, so without even needing to go too much further, let's just, how would we modify that? Here's anatomy without having to know anatomy. It's always helpful to know it, but if not, if we wanted to look at creating more of a female character, a slighter build to a character, if we don't want to gender it, then maybe we'll make this taper more, have more curve, right? And lose a lot of the square or the angular, right, at the bottom. That has a different feeling than this. We could substitute feel for anatomy, right? But here I'm trying to offer something other than anatomy. Anatomy can be the conduit for different types of feeling, right? That's the goal, I think. Or, right, so that would be one direction. Another direction would be, what if we created a complete square at the bottom? This also feels different as a result of anatomy. That would be more like a Hulk face, or the Hulk, or like some character like that. A brute character might have a really big, broad, wide jaw and bite. So that would be just the shape and the immediate kind of play with that shape. As I said or mentioned over here, one thing I think is really useful is to still try to capture or remember where those center lines are. So I could still use that center line for the face, or we could say, let's label this a symmetry line. it's still useful to get those turns or tilts or just as a tool, right? I'm really trying to be careful not to add too much in terms of the technical language or, all the steps from the other approach just because I don't want to burden this with it. But having the center line or a symmetry line to your shape is good for that. Next part. So let's give some colors to these two so that we can have fun making them look different. So let's make our heads blue. And then on top of this or below this, we're going to add our jaw shape. Jaw shape, we're done. Let's add the neck. Okay, so neck shape can be here. Well, where do I want to place my neck? Do I need to know all the anatomy of the trap and sternomastoid and all those other things? No. So let's just look at the neck as a shape. Where does the neck begin or connect into the head? So we're leaning more towards the observed, the observational, the 2D, and leaving some of the invention, analytical stuff behind. Maybe in this generic figure, the neck will just begin here. So I'm going to side it off the drop of that jaw. So let's say it's here and here. And then if you go back to my old buildup of the proportions, the way I would find the neck, in case anybody is desperate for some of that, is to break this 2 and 3 up into thirds. So I go here, here, and then this first third is where the neck in the front view, which is what we're doing, will generally hit. So here's our neck. Let's keep it as a simple square. Right. So, and then let's also give it a color, because otherwise my OCD will start acting up. I'll develop anxiety. So there's our square neck. That is the part. So that's the part. What can we do with that part? Well, that part also has a certain quality of gesture to it. Right? So how could we define gesture now that we did our necks over here, or I'm sorry, our heads over here? So if we say that the next part is some kind of average neck that we're saying is a square or a rectangle, how will this take on a gesture? Well, I would still say that gesture is best defined as adopting some kind of C or S relationship to a form, a stretch or pinch, something that indicates for a quality of motion. So here's our part. That's the center line. Let's add it. Because we have these heads over here, let's add it. So if I have this head leaning to the right, maybe this side would stretch and this side would pinch. So there's a neck shape or part with a gesture. So now we've given it a different type of relationship on this side, which I would like to see, or I tend to see as having an S, a long stretch. This side would be a C, and then that creates the bottom there. And then in this approach, because I don't have that fluidity of gesture in the early curve to set up the figure, I like to look through the center lines, so these symmetry lines here, to find that rhythm. And I'll do this on later whole figures so that you see it, but try to notice as I go through how the center line of each kind of flows or works into the next. Right, so that's the center line of the head, which is symmetrical, and then I'm starting to lean it toward one side because it's now that center line for the neck maybe is more 3/4. So ask yourself, as a study of shape or as a study of a part, what can each part do? Your head can tilt and turn and lift up or down. Your neck can present as vertical, lean side to side, maybe turn a little bit, twist a little bit. Whoops. So it's all those things, but then it has that last category too, which would be the modification of the shape. Okay, so the character, we look at character again. So let's color in these heads. So we said that this would be a slider build from this side. This side might be something it's more brutish. Maybe a villainous shape might have a sharper quality or corner to it somewhere. But maybe this person's shape is more thin. Maybe this person's neck would be more trapezoidal and start higher. So this would be the modification stage, where I'm thinking about or I'm interested in the idea of what it can do, what the part allows the body to do. That would be the more traditional anatomy aspect to me. But then there's also this stage, which is the anatomy without anatomy. Right? The identification with the whole arrangement or negotiation of part. There is the impact of all the anatomy underneath and how it produces a different identification with your audience on the side of body type. Body type, a good word for that? Or build. So that would be the modification. And then the perspective part would be giving wrapping lines. So how can we quickly identify with some kind of surface mapping that gives a perspective? Well, the perspective, if it's front view, is that this is going to come forward. And our big perspective ways of orienting a subject or a part, and this will go back. That would just be building off of principles of the spine that we talk about in the other class, the other way of approaching things. So it's always funny too, like what you end up using as an approach will elicit or develop or allow different qualities of your subject to emerge. It's like that old bizarre saying, not bizarre, but the old saying that if you have a hammer, everything else kind of looks like a nail, or the solution to the problem is always the same as the basic gist. If you're always using a constructive anatomy approach, you're only always going to learn about that. If you're only using a Riley approach, you'll only ever see the qualities that approach elicits and brings out in a figure. That just by definition will always be limiting. So the more the better, right? Because you want to know more, see more, develop more. Okay, so that's our survey through first couple parts. Again, we're just going to do the front view here because I don't want this to be bogged down and burdened by just information on developing a mannequin. I think once you see it, you'll get the basic gist of it, and then we'll demonstrate different views. That's how we can start to get into the sides and the 3/4 and the back views more. And what I've done up here that I think is kind of fun is I'm just developing an index of parts. So let's make a little dictionary of parts over here. So you can tweak these any way you want. But I have my neck shape. I have my head shape. And this is my slow build to what I'm really interested in is, if you start to look at design, whether it's in the history of American illustration or character design, why do we always see the same bodies in the same character types? Why do cute characters always look the same? Why do villains always look the same? There's a formulaic logic to what people are doing that I think is the research side of character design that sometimes we pass over when we're talking about anatomy. So there's a head, here's a neck. Those are shapes that are built of anatomy that we are still able to draw without. Next will be our torso. And this is going to be fantastic because, if we were doing the torso in our other approach, we would have to break down rib cage and waist and pelvis. It's horrible. So in this, what I would do to start to build is just find one beginning line. And maybe you could think of this as your shoulder tilt. From there, here's my pit of the neck. And then off of that, I like to look for the width. So how wide do I want that to be? So let's just say wanted to bring that in because that's the connection proper. But what's the part? Well, the part of the torso for me is just going to be a big tube. It's that dumb. So let's make it purple. Let's just look. Let's spend some time just with the part up here. So if this is our part, that's done. Well, what does that summarize? So sometimes it can be fun to make the mannequin and then try to reverse engineer it and explain the bones inside. I don't think you have to, but this summarizes rib cage, waist, pelvis into one large form or shape. To work with it, if this is our front view, as I was explaining over on the map, I like to find the pit of the neck because it gives us that symmetry line. So that's just where the symmetry line is. And then once I have that, then I try to go to the sides and find that width. That's the shoulder tilt. Same thing, the bottom. If we just define this top as the shoulder and its tilt, let's say this is the bottom of the pelvis and its tilt. Okay, that's the shape. What is the gesture? What can this do? It can do a lot, right? So maybe I want to angle the tilt of the shoulders. So let's take that line, move it over here. Maybe I want to see there's more of a stretch in the center line. So I'll do a big line like that. And then I'm going to do my sides after. So here's the outside. Maybe this is leaning. So I'm going to make a couple C curves on this side and create a pinch. And then why is that pinching there? Oh, maybe the leg has weight on that side. So every line I just moved over and gave some kind of gestural property to. So let's color it. So that would be one way of describing shape. And if you're looking for an exercise, this is a great way to play around and get your bearings with this approach. You can come into each shape and just play around with looking at different distortions, finding different types and configurations, bending, pinching, turning, right? So my gesture to this is that it's 3/4. The symmetry line indicates that it's going in that direction. This side is stretched, so there's an S. This side is pinched, and then the tilt from the weight of the figure is reflected differently in top and bottom. What's left? Well, there's a couple things. We could think about body type. How would I show differences in body type based on what we have here? Right, so we start out the basic square. That's the generic body type. Another body type could be, look at a feminine body type. Could be this. Now I know that probably sounds sexist, but I'm not intending it to be. So that's where I would start to look at history. So let's say we're looking at history, at all the things that we love, or maybe all the artists that we appreciate and admire. Like in American illustration, it's usually Norman Rockwell, J.C. Leyendecker, Charles Dana Gibson. But what I'm seeing, or what I'm kind of bringing to the table as far as that shape, let's just take the example of Charles Dana Gibson, American illustration. That's the body type that he is responsible for and probably famous for, is the Gibson girl. Gibson girl was, not just a look, it was also an ethos, or kind of a type of woman that you could see in his commercial illustrations of the Bachelor and the interplay of the female figure in The Bachelor and his collection of editorial drawings about high society, the dynamic between the sexes. But his type is this archetype. And what is that archetype? Well, it's a gross exaggeration of female anatomy that he's famous for, because he created a look or a body type that is inaccessible. So right, nobody looks like this, but it's a very full or kind of bell-like design. And so now we might start to shift, right? It's because we're looking at the modification of a shape relative to body type. So how could we take that even further? Well, just one example of an artist and their use of body type here would say, why would an illustrator do this? Or why would they show a body in that way? Well, the history of American illustration in terms of the different presentation of a body is to communicate desire. This is probably the formulaic concern of any ad. You want to communicate desire. A desire for what? A desire for something that people don't have. So let's say a lack. Why would you want to create a lack? Because if you communicate a lack that people don't have, then they're going to want to substitute for that lack with a product. So here, now we're generating an array of products that people need to accomplish, right? To get that look. So a corset would help, right? A way to distort the body and the anatomical features of the body to create something that isn't there. And that brings us to that, right? So is there some grounding for this? Yeah, sure. We could say that the female body might have more subcutaneous and structural fat. The hips, the inner thigh, the knee, the back of the tricep, those are all areas that we would see differences. This is more design difference. And what I'm interested in terms of how I would use this in my own work is, well, then why does that change 10 years later into the exact opposite? How do we get from, and why do we get from this to this? Why do we get to the flapper? Why is the flapper the next iteration of the female in American illustration? And why is it thin, angular, right? Kind of frantic in terms of the positionings between the body parts. If you look at the dance over here, like that's such a stark contrast to what we would see in the late 1800s. Right, so what can I learn about that? Why is the body, this isn't a resemblance to what bodies look like, right? This versus that, those are distortions. Well, how can I understand, use those, maybe even understand a little bit of the history behind them as a predictive tool, right? Maybe I could start to see the same things in, right, contemporary culture. Maybe that gives me an edge when I'm designing characters because I can see a little bit further down the road than somebody else, or communicating my own stories. Right, so that's kind of an area we can end up in eventually. Back up here, right, so how will we just map it onto our basic figure? Well, we did our start. Here's the pit of the neck, down. That gives us all the way to our fourth head, right, in the overall build. Just kind of zooming back here, you can see that whole figure. And then how wide do we want to make it? Well, you can shift this around. You can make it broad, you can make it narrow, you can try to match different body types like I did here, kind of shifting it from one look to another. Or if we go to the character archetype, thinking of character archetype, if I start to push all of the mass in a torso high and up, then I'm starting to identify with that whole brute look. So if you think of the character of the brute in your lineup of that roster of character types, the brute is always that character that has mass held high. So you would just take all the width and the energy or the height, push it up. So let's see this character. Anytime we push mass up, we create an impending sense of gravity, right? The idea that this could fall feels more dangerous or ominous. So that'd be another way to adjust for the shape of something early on. So I've taken the basic tube that is the ribcage pelvis. I've thinned the bottom and expanded the top. Again, anatomy without anatomy. I've also made it a little bit longer. I've proportionally made the legs a bit shorter so that they feel a little bit more incapable of holding all of that up. Creates a little bit more of a tension between the weight of the top and then the smaller shapes of the bottom. If the head is the same, you could do the same thing with the head shape. Broaden that mass towards the top, thin it at the bottom. Right? But that would be the result of trap, chest, deltoid, right? All those things that maybe we don't want to learn. So we've gone from this to this to this. Okay? Here's our shape over here, just to create our basic little mannequin guy. We can pinch, stretch, change, modify shape. And then we'll do that's our last step, just some perspective. But now I also have the last problem, which would be here's 3 shapes. So I have 3 shapes. So what am I going to do with these? I'm a little concerned that maybe they might be not aligned. maybe disproportion, not connected. Well, we'll double check. So maybe I could measure, I could look at this negative shape here, I could cite how far off is that shoulder. Maybe I could start to create some shapes of anatomy that would fuse these, like a triangle for the trap. You don't have to do any of that, but it would be the kind of in reference to that little star section I put down here. Just trying to be observant of my connection so I don't get too crazy, too far afield from what I want these things to be doing. And then last, here's some perspective lines. I know my rib cage, as a result of the spine, is going to lean back. And then I know my pelvis is going to lean the other way. That's also a result of the spine. And so that would be it. Muscle shapes I can pattern and kind of layer over. Or I could just light it. Or you could just use this as a base to begin tonal mapping on top. Okay, so that's done. We went through the part, the turn or gesture of the rib cage or torso shape. I even took you on a little journey into my insanity where you could look at how I would start to interpret body type throughout American illustration. I do the same thing with art history in terms of schools and movements and what would be the more acceptable canon of art history that is not illustration. And then we did the placement in terms of the center and then the shoulders off the edge and how it sits in proportion to the rest of the heads. Now let's go into legs. So what would be a shape that we want to use for our leg? Let's do a different color here. Well, I would say the legs for me are always one of two types when I'm not doing anatomy. They are always either a B or an S. So there's a pretty reliable type. And I'm going to cut the figure into 7.5 heads. So that's going to be my framework there. And if I start to create my leg, let's do one that's just straightforward. That's a lime green. Anytime a leg is facing front, I always think of it as a B. So like this. So the B is anatomy, again, without anatomy, by way of thinking. From a front view, I tend to get comfortable thinking about the muscles and their groupings in the leg as having a high held shape twice. So there's a height to the mass of a shape in the upper leg due to the quadriceps. And that would be about a 2/3 to 1/3 proportional breakup for the upper leg. The straight here would be communicating the ligaments, the track, the outside of the knee. And then we get another push for the calf. So it looks like a B, backwards, but a B. So that would be here. And then you could see I kind of like to attach it with a little bit of a diagonal. You don't have to do that, but it helps me just feel like it's fused or integrated a little bit more. The 7.5 head figure is one I like to use. Just feels a little bit more academic, but you could change this to whatever you want. Again, proportion is going to be subject to story, what you want to say with your body type. So here's that. And I know that has curve and wave and rhythm to it and undulation for that inside line, but this is how I'm designing it. And then back out. And then anytime the leg for me would be turned. So this is, again, just taking on some of that thinking of the hip on the outside there, incorporating the leg into the bottom of the torso. Then I'll make it an S. So any 3/4 side, I tend to see more of an S in the leg. So B versus S is my distinction between parts in this. So here's that. I'll color it in real quick. And then we'll talk about why do we get that. Okay. Oops. So B, why the S? The S for me in 3/4 profile is always showing more of the rhythm or the exchange between the two areas of mass that we set up in the B. So the first would be the quadriceps. And the pattern for this view of a leg is always curve and then straight. So that's quadriceps, hamstrings in anatomy language. If that's offensive, then you could just pretend I didn't say it. And then calf in the back, it's higher with more mass and a nice offset asymmetry to the quadriceps. And then the straight of the bone in front. Feels more in total like an S to me. So there's our V. And then just to make it a little bit more, let's do a full profile in this little scheme down here. That'll go this way. So the S would be the curve, straight, curve on the back, straight in the front, and then kind of a flow into the foot. And again, you could shape this, make it look like however you want, which is again, what I'm trying to lead you into, although we're taking a little time to build this up. I think it'll make a difference later on to have some of the grounding here. So again, that's a type for a leg, type for a torso. We could push these, pull them, make something longer, shorter, rounder, squarer, and that's going to result in different storytelling for different body types. Again, anatomy without it. For the leg, that's the part. Now, what could the gesture of a leg be? Well, gestures for legs could be bending, right? So I would say maybe a leg we could get triangles for legs really easily. Maybe if a leg is crouched, I'm going to get this really clear triangle shape from one direction to another. So that in a leg, we get this still C or S curve versus straight, but then this shape exchanges and goes the opposite way. So your legs, in other words, can flex and extend. That's the gesture of the leg. The wrapping line would be this comes out at a more extreme perspective. This goes back at a more extreme perspective. Or maybe the leg changes in terms of its rotation. Like, so then maybe I'll incorporate a center line to the leg. Here's the center of this leg, and then I'm going to let that kind of move and flow into where the center of the knee would be. And that helps me track that, oh, this leg is actually kind of 3/4. Whereas this is more profile. So that would be using the leg to play with different tilts, turns, rotations, and then what would the modification of the part look like? Well, we could probably make this feel different. Maybe it's, if it's a bodybuilder leg, it might be really broad. If it's a Disney princess leg, maybe it's really narrow. So the shape will adjust to communicate that difference in type instead of needing the anatomy to inform it. Formulaically, the legs from the front would always come forward to the knee. At least that's how I would use them. And then backward to the ankle. So what are we trying to keep there would just be a feeling of that asymmetry. Asymmetry meaning, in this case, how can I bring out and continue to remind you about features of the spine that prevent this from looking too flat or too graphic? So like my wrapping lines are doing most of the heavy lifting in that regard. Like the head is leaning back, the neck is leaning forward, rib cage leans back. Those are all 3D directions that the spine is setting up early on. That we'd want to remember, especially for like light and shadow too. All right, and even though we have these floating heads and necks here to the sides, the idea would be that you could fill in the body types with some of the notes that we've made along the way. Again, this is just my mapping for process that we're going to demonstrate more later. Okay, so that's that. Legs are done. So the only thing that's left is arms, of course. So arms, I like to do the same thing, keep a broad way of communicating common motions or configuration to the arm. So let's use a different color here. For the arm, I would start it by trying to tack on the side in whatever height I think it communicates or proportional relationship it communicates to that body. But I mostly think of the arms as S curves. So as a whole, as the arm pulls off the body, I'm going to do an upper and lower. But the whole of the shape, when the arm is extended, always feels very S-like to me. And let's say this is going to be a pronated hand. So kind of the arms turned in there. Here's our shape. Hopefully you can see how this would nicely or conveniently be able to expand, contract, and become something that is buff or elegant or athletic, right? But just by bloating the shape or moving it. And then anything that is not outstretched on the side of the body would be like the leg. So the leg will have its S or B variation or triangle if bent. It's kind of the way I'm informing or trying to map a process for gesture. The same is true of the arm. When the arm bends, the kind of very static example of that would be, it looks to me like a triangle or an arrow, or however you want to think about it. So I'm thinking not just of the shape, but also the negative shape that's left by it. So those two things. So this would be a mannequin. What I mean as I continue to use that term is some kind of foundational way of expressing the relationships of the body that doesn't also finish it. So this is a tool that I could start to look at body type, character, ways that the figure is communicating differently so that I could begin to participate with a more direct expression of body language, body type, anatomy, without doing all the muscles. And then here would be that last step, which could just be the perspective. So there's a complete kind of workflow or look for how I'm going to start to distill the body into a set of relationships that's very different from the last approach that I've used. This is what I'm going to take and then start to use as a lens to look at other historical figures, genres like illustration, character design, and then to begin just different body types. How do people look differently? The problem with the last approach is every mannequin looked like a robot, right? So this would be my corrective to that if you've ever experienced or kind of worked with the same.